So today we'll be covering symbolic interactionism. This will be your introduction and brief overview, getting you kind of warmed up and primed for how to think from a symbolic interactionist perspective. And this perspective is heavily focused on symbols and meaning. But before we get started, some quick reminders and updates. Your first quiz will be graded this week. I do go through and grade every question and make sure everybody got the correct number of points added to their grade. Sometimes I make comments, so keep an eye out for that. Your first activity is also due this Friday by 11:59 p.m. and that is now uploaded to Canvas. And make sure that before completing that you watch the supplementary videos and also read the background overview that I provide in that document, just to kind of, again, refresh your memory and get you thinking more about symbolic interactionism. And then finally, no class next Monday. It's a university holiday. It's Labor Day, so I hope you guys have a great Labor Day weekend. But before then, I will see you one more time this Wednesday. So going ahead and getting started, and this will go rather quickly for those of you who are unable to attend lecture in person, because a lot of this will be class discussion, but I do want you to maybe pause the video and think about these things each time I ask some of these questions. So why do people smoke despite evidence that is harmful to their own health and others' health? And I want you to consider that for a minute. What are the reasons why people might smoke? And at this point, you should pause the video because I'll be going into some detail here in a second. So first, again, going back to what's very important in terms of symbolic interaction, is that definition of the situation. What's the context, who is involved, and what are the meanings assigned to something like smoking? What are the meanings assigned to health? And again, in terms of context, like someone's age, right? Someone who's older may be more or less concerned than someone who's younger. But again, taking into consideration that symbolic interactionism analyzes society by addressing those subjective meanings that people impose on objects, events, and behaviors, again, such as smoking and health. And so some of the reason that people might smoke despite evidence that it's harmful is maybe they think it's cool, especially, back in the day it was something that was very much marketed as cool. Maybe it's to get a positive, to have a positive image in the eyes of their peers, so maybe to fit in. Some people smoke because it's a good stress relief, in their opinion. Maybe to suppress appetite. Supposedly that is a side effect for some people. And there's a variety of reasons. But the symbolic meaning of smoking, like let's say a stress relief, it overrides the actual facts regarding smoking and risk. And so in this case, or in all the cases we'll be discussing in terms of symbolic interactionism, what a cigarette represents, it's a symbol. It symbolizes, again, maybe stress relief or fitting in. And a symbol is anything that stands for something else and has an agreed upon meaning attached to it. And this could be truly anything, from art to literature to being an aunt, being a mom, being a dad, a friend, a teacher, student, the expectations we have for each other, the language we use, the gestures we use, our own behavior and beliefs, our values, money, what we consider profit, loss, wealth, even aspects of social structure like class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So what do you think when you see this on someone's car? Do you make judgments about the people inside the car? Does it not really catch your attention? Does it make you change your behavior in any way or your perspective? And what about this? what do you think when you see this? Does it change your behavior or your perspective? So what's interesting to note about this baby on board sign, it's actually a very successful campaign. They found that it actually does changes people's behavior, even though there's a lot of jokes about it being kind of silly. Like they say, oh yeah, now I'm going to see that and that's going to make me drive a bit more safely. But they found that it does. And if this changes our behavior, then why doesn't something like this change our behavior? It says the same thing. It says that this person is at the very least a parent, but that there's likely children in the car. So why doesn't that change our behavior in the same way this does? And we would ask ourselves, like, what is it in our culture? How have we been socialized to see this as something that might change our behavior a bit more than something like this? And again, if you are unable to attend lecture in person, I want you to kind of consider what makes these two things different and why do they affect our behavior differently and why do they affect our perception differently. And again, we look at those things and how does that change our behavior? Does it change your behavior in the same way when you're coming around the corner and you see something like this? It may or may not make you drive more safely. Maybe you were already driving safely and so that isn't an issue. But it may or may not have a similar effect, even though they are radically different symbols and they mean very different things. And again, to like some people, like seeing the baby on board side, again, given our own experiences and like the roles we occupy in our own lives, like if someone's a parent, they're going to view that a bit differently than someone who isn't. Let's say somebody who has had a speeding ticket before, that's going to affect their behavior differently when they see law enforcement who's waiting around the corner. And again, given those experiences, you may or may not like be affected, say, by the baby on board sign, but when you see like a police officer, like you might feel maybe a sense of fear. And again, those things are important, that what these symbols mean to different people based on their experiences. And people can even still feel those things like maybe fear or caution. And they may have not even had an interaction, let's say with law enforcement, but it still evokes that similar feeling to someone who maybe has had that experience. But again, they've taken in that information somewhere. They formed this opinion and attached this meaning to these symbols for a variety of different reasons. And what about, how would you behave differently if you had tea with the Queen versus having coffee with friends? Would you sit differently? Would you speak differently? Would you know how to hold the teacup properly? Would you be at all self-conscious about that? Or about maybe the topic of conversation? How might that look different? And how might it be different if the Queen is interpreting your behavior based on your friends interpreting your behavior? Right? Because you have a social bond with your friends and they know you, they know your behavior, they know your character and who you are, and how those gestures and words, your posture even, something like that, could be perceived very differently based on the person who is perceiving it. And that's something that's important to note for symbolic interactionism, is that our actions are based on the meaning that we give to situations, events, and people, but also that meanings arise from the interaction process, and they are not fixed but are negotiable and changeable. And the meanings we give to situations are the result of these interpretive procedures we use. So figuring out, like, again, not only are we like taking in these meanings and we're viewing these symbols, but we're also interpreting them, so putting our own spin on them, so to speak. So going back to that basis in pragmatism, where reality is indistinguishable from human agency, the interpretation process is referring to that human agency. So we're processing it through our own minds and our own perspectives and experiences. That's what we're filtering this information through, and it creates kind of its own maybe slightly different meanings, or radically different meanings, or meanings that are similar for others as well. And so going back to that, these meanings that arise from interaction and how they're subject to change. So you go in, let's say, you're having tea with the Queen, and you're like, this is the Queen of England, like she's very proper, she's very dignified, and what if she just has horrible table manners and she's very rude and crass and just not a nice person? Well, if that were the case, then maybe the meanings that arise during that situation, they would kind of shift. So what you once perceived as someone who's very dignified, you're seeing as somebody who's maybe not a very nice person, and then you will judge her words and gestures and so on much differently. And finally, which professor would you rather ask for an extension? And again, the difference is maybe somewhat subtle to some of you. It may be more pronounced to others. But I would assume that most people would choose the man on the left. He looks a little more laid back. His shirt's a little less formal. He has tattoos. He has he's smiling a bit. Maybe he seems like someone who might be more approachable, easier to talk to. And so we're taking cues from what he's wearing and his facial expressions, and all of these things, we're taking it in. And they have meaning attached to them, right? Like the tattoos, for example, they have meaning not only for him, but for those who are viewing him, who are perceiving him as a person. And so we might say that seems much more laid back, someone who's maybe more open to experiences and ideas, whatever your interpretation is. The way he has his shirt rolled up, that might convey, again, maybe he's a bit more relaxed. But all of these things have meaning. And these examples may seem trivial, but what symbolic interactionists study is how these meanings and impressions play out in one-on-one interactions, as well as interactions, between and among groups. And while we all attach different meanings to various symbols, what happens when the symbol is more than just a road sign or a brand or a gesture or the words you use or the clothing you wear, whatever. But what happens when those symbols are something like race, class, gender, religion, where a person's from, a person's accent, a person's social status, occupation, and so on? And how do these influence behavior? How a person is treated, or whether or not they get a promotion, if they get a good grade, and a variety of other behaviors and outcomes. And how do these micro-level interactions create broad sweeping patterns of disparity not only on a societal level, but within institutions, organizations, and even small groups? And so again, the things to which we attach meaning, all of this meaning in our interpretation process even is influenced by the culture in which we're socialized. And there's two different types of culture, material and non-material, and both consist of all the shared products of human groups. So material culture is concrete and tangible. Truly anything from books to phones, clothing, building, roads, tools, furniture, monuments, food, art, and so on. Whereas non-material culture is more abstract, like language, values, beliefs, norms, assumptions, traditions, family types, economic systems, laws, folklore, and so on. And we ask, how does non-material culture in particular, how does it shape our culture as a whole? And how does our culture shape things like language and values and beliefs and so on? And how does that in turn influence those more concrete and tangible products? What about things like determining what's considered right and wrong? What's considered truth? What's considered a norm? And so all of these things are called objects, nonetheless, whether or not they're material or non-material culture. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, they would be considered objects, whether tangible or intangible. And an object is symbolically designated things, ideas, people, activities, behaviors, and purposes, and so on and so forth. An object is anything to which attention can be paid and toward which action can be directed. A social object, in this sense, comes into existence as the result of a social act. In other words, it's an object born from shared experience, understanding, and meaning. An example of a social object is love. And so, again, looking at that, how a social object is the result of a social act, then we look at acts. So there's acts or social acts. And an act does not consist merely of what may be observed by others, but it also entails an internal process of control in which the individual directs conduct towards some goal or object. And there are individual acts and social acts. So from a symbolic interactionist perspective, an individual act is an interaction with the self, whereas a social act is an interaction with others. And so that brings about a brief discussion on the mind, self, and society. And so from a symbolic interactionist perspective, the mind is the ability to use symbols with common social meanings. The self is the ability to reflect on ourselves from the perspective of others. In society, this is the web of social relationships that humans create. And you'll see some overlap in those premises and assumptions from symbolic interactionism. But these three are very important to remember and what we mean when we say the self. Again, it's our ability to reflect on ourselves from the perspective of others. So being able to take on the perspective of someone else and interpret the world through their unique lens, which can be difficult if you've had different experiences from them. And the self, again, is that self-perception is influenced by our interactions, and not just like the way that we interact with our own self, but like the way we interact with family, with friends, with society as a whole, the types of messages that we're taking in and interpreting, and are also influenced by the beliefs about how we're perceived by others, or in observation of how others react to us, and interpretations of those reactions. And again, a lot of this happens through the process of socialization. We learn those norms and sanctions associated with them, both positive and negative. So those reactions and the way that people react to us and perceive us. And these norms and expectations are largely determined, again, by our interactions, which are influenced by aspects of social structure like age, race, gender, class, and so on, as well as roles, power, status, etc. And while these norms and expectations are socially constructed, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't matter. And they matter because we say they do. And this is how our social reality becomes socially constructed. And so finally, just to really emphasize the importance of the word self here, is that it's the human capacity to exert control over conduct, to coordinate behavior with that of others, and create complex social acts and social objects. It is linked to a uniquely human phenomenon, which is the possession of the self. And later on in the semester, we'll talk a little bit more about the self as an object versus the self as a process. And so, why is it important to understand what things mean to people? For what purposes do we want to understand meaning and the symbols associated with that meaning? One question we might ask is, how can categories and labels change the way you think about different acts and objects? In what ways does language convey value and difference? And so some examples I have here are referring to a partner as a trophy. Again, how does that convey value and difference? And how does it shape our perception? If you're referring to a partner as a trophy, right? Yes, this theory uses the word object, so it's kind of silly here to say like it's objectifying another human, while simultaneously referring to them as an object. But bear with me here. How does that maybe objectify a person, and who exactly do we objectify, and how does that shape the ways in which we interact with different people? What about describing someone's body as pear-shaped? And so not only are we describing its shape and its form, but it's being compared to food. And how might that shape not only the way other people view that person's body, but how the person themselves views their own body. Instead of giving it some sort of, made-up name or, whatever the case may be, it's being compared to food. And then another example is the difference between using the words downtown versus inner city. And this is a big one. How it was almost a new term created to subtly refer to things that the general public, but largely politicians, couldn't necessarily say. So inner city arose after the term inner city arose after white flight out of cities and into suburbs in the 1950s and 60s. And so the public, but again, largely politicians in particular, began to associate the words inner city with poor urban areas in a way that wrongly but effectively connects crime, violence, and poverty with race. So it's very much a racialized term. And if you're saying we're going downtown, or I'm from the downtown area versus we're going, it's an inner city area, or this person's from this inner city area. How might that shape your perception of that person in that place? And so the purpose of symbolic interactionism is not to necessarily resolve any of this, but to understand why this might be the case, maybe to even understand how it should be handled, which leads to equity, justice, and legitimation, which is something we'll discuss later on in the semester. And finally, again, just a quick reminder and overview of those assumptions of symbolic interactionism, which draw from that pragmatist tradition. And so the first says, meaning is given to people and objects by the person perceiving them. Self-concept motivates behavior, and again, that's understanding ourself in relation to others and how others view us. In context is the relationship between individuals and society is distinct. So it's this very specific and important relationship between individuals and society. And again, these aren't necessarily the premises of symbolic interactionism. These are the assumptions, so the things you must accept in order to properly understand and work with this theory. And then we have the three premises. And so it might be a bit confusing, these assumptions and premises, but they are essential to understanding the foundation of symbolic interactionism, as well as other theories we're going to discuss in this class. So while symbolic interactionism is important, it's important to put it, that's why I put it at the beginning of the semester, but also where instead of having 4 days, we have 3, because it is very essential to review symbolic interactionism and these assumptions and premises, but it's not really getting to the meat of what we're going to be discussing this semester in terms of social psychology. But it is very much the foundation of many of the things we're going to discuss. And so those 3 premises, the first being individuals act toward things on the basis of the meanings they ascribe to those things. The second says that meaning is derived from or arises out of the social interaction that one has with others in society. The third says meanings are created and modified through an interpretive process. And again, you all have heard this before at various points as we're discussing symbolic interactionism. But I think it's good to lay them out in terms of assumptions and premises. The premises are really the foundation of the theory. Those three things that you have to kind of see as like pillars to which you can affix anything else. You can build on top of that. And the foundation, I would say, are those assumptions. And so thinking about these things and what symbolic interaction is capable of, what the purpose of it is, and how it can contribute to our understanding of the interactions among individuals, groups, and society as a whole. I want you to think about that so that when we come back Wednesday, we can get kind of more into symbolic interactionism, its application, and some of the nuance associated with it, and some of the things that have been done so far in the field. So that's all for today, and thank you for listening. Thank you for reviewing the lecture and the slides, and please don't forget to watch the supplementary videos this week. I think they're really good, concise overviews of what you need to understand following this section on symbolic interactionism. Thanks.